So Anna, I may try handing over to you at some point and then see if we can hear you, if that's okay. Perfect. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Perfect. So as Aubrey mentioned at the start, Anna and I are both researchers at the Alan Turing Institute, both of us within the Centre for Emerging Technology and Security. And we're going to be speaking to you today about a project we have done recently on artificial intelligence in wargaming. And this was funded by DSTL, which is the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in the UK.
Sorry, Roa, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can, Anna.
Okay.
That's perfect. Anna's meant to do the beginning of
it.
Perfect, yes.
Should I take over?
Yeah, you take over.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for taking over when I couldn't be heard. So just very quickly, we're just going to introduce the Alan Turing Institute. We have a pretty unique place in the security and technology ecosystem over in the UK. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what the study aims and method were for this particular study, and then what we found, and then hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A. There definitely will be time for Q&A at the end. Next slide. So we're the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Data Science. We were founded by the universities that you see on the screen, and we have three main missions. So the first is to advance world-class research and to apply it to real-world problems. So contrary to academic research institutions, we don't just do research for research's sake. We have a prioritized set of real-world problems that all seek to help the UK achieve its strategic objectives in AI. And we also try to train the leaders of the future. So we try to empower senior decision makers, but also students to understand how AI could potentially contribute to global societal challenges, but also how we can mitigate the risks. And then we try to lead the public conversation on AI over in the UK. There's a lot of hype and hyperbole around AI, so we're the technical authority on AI. Next slide, please. So our defense and security program has three main strands, and Roa and I sit within the policy research work stream of our defense and security program. But in the beginning, we mainly did fundamental and applied research in AI. We do some work for GCHQ, DSTL, the Ministry of Defense, DSO Singapore. We have a Defense AI Research Center that works really closely with DSTL and GCHQ, but also Army Research Lab, the US DoD. We have an AI for Cyber Defense Center that's doing a lot of interesting work on RL in cybersecurity. And since last year, we set up the Center for Emerging Technology and Security to essentially enable better communication between policymakers, practitioners, and the technical experts around the opportunities and risks of AI for the defense and security community. So we apply a lot of the literature on responsible AI to specific defense and security contexts. And this study was one of them. In this study, we looked at the potential of AI for wargaming. Next slide, please. You can see some examples of our past research on the screen. We do a lot of collaborative work. One of them was on autonomous cyber defense that was collaborative with CSAT Georgetown. We've done some work mainly around AI and intelligence analysis. So there's been a lot of work on human machine teaming and intelligence analysis, behavioral analytics, OSINT, but increasingly we're doing more and more with defense as well. Next slide. So onto this particular study, I'm going to hand back over to Roa to tell you a little bit about the genesis for this particular research.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to skip over this first slide on context fairly quickly, as I'm sure everyone in this audience will be quite familiar with these changes to the broader global threat environment, which very much motivated us in doing the study. And just to note here that these very much included things such as sub-threshold threats, which are on the rise, and necessitating updates to the analytical toolkit, which defense decision makers are using to map future needs for their forces. But we were very much motivated by the intrinsic nature of wargaming itself and some of the challenges that are inherent in this methodology. So these are listed on the screen here, but they include the requirement for resource-intensive preparations, often with a lot of senior decision maker time, which is not easy to get. Often this delays things and means the decisions aren't made at the rate they need to be done in order to make wargaming a truly useful methodology. There are also other issues here which relate into the relationship that wargaming has with broader modeling and simulation technologies. So for example, the limited repeatability of wargaming and the lack of clear methods for capturing data, particularly from manual wargames, such that those insights can feed into longer term future decisions. We though weren't just motivated by these challenges in the defense context. As Anna mentioned, we're from the Alan Turing Institute, which has a very broad remit in AI in the UK. And we were very much motivated by the wider context of developments that have been taking place here. So what you see on screen here is DeepMind's AlphaGo, where an AI agent was able to beat a human master in the game of Go. This is very relevant for the likes of wargaming, but actually there is more relevant, if perhaps not such high profile research, in particular by DeepMind. So here we're thinking of things like using AI agents to beat human players in the board game of diplomacy, where tactical behaviors such as alliance formation need to be understood by the AI agents in order for them to beat human players. And beyond this, there are perhaps slightly different ways in which AI has succeeded in game AI. Here we're thinking of things like Dota and StarCraft, which are big multiplayer electronic video games where AI has to navigate a lot of information all at once. Again, really relevant for war games. So this progress led to a lot of excitement from the defense community. But we do emphasize throughout our research that the kinds of decision spaces involved in these games tend to be a lot smaller than in a war game. So just because there have been successes here, it doesn't mean it will translate into the AI context. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this study was commissioned by DSTL in the UK, and they had some quite specific interests they wanted us to look into. So these included some more low tier interests, like reducing the time requirements of battle staff or helping players concentrate on key decisions. But there might also be some much more ambitious aims, which are at the bottom, things like enabling players to leverage real-time intelligence within a game to improve the outcomes and decisions that can be made on that. So as you'll notice throughout this presentation, we will divide things between the kind of lower tier, shorter term, easier applications, and those more intractable challenges which AI might be able to resolve in really the longer term. And then finally, I think before I hand back to Anna, I'm going to briefly discuss some of the other sectors we looked into for the study. DSTL were very interested that we look beyond defence. The word cloud on screen here is illustrative of our research engagements during interviews, where people repeatedly raised to us other sectors which we should be looking at, where AI is being leveraged in a similar way to how it might be useful in a war game. These weren't actually the only ones we looked at, and we did ourselves look beyond this to things like international diplomacy and peacemaking. I'll just highlight here how this might relate to AI and wargaming. So if you take healthcare and psychiatry as an example, in this field there's much progress towards using things like AI chatbots and decision aids to help, whether it's psychiatrists or surgeons in high stakes decision-making contexts in real time. And there's been a lot of interest in redeploying that towards course of action analysis in a wargaming context. But the sectors aren't obviously so related always to real world use cases for AI and wargaming. In the case of self-driving cars, the relevance to AI for wargaming was perhaps more technical. People just saw the way in which lots of AI systems need to interact together in a complex system as being relevant for AI and wargaming. So this is what motivated us to do the study. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Anna to give some more specifics on our research aims.
So overall, we tried to do 4 things. First, we needed to understand what's the state of the art in AI-enabled wargaming systems. Where are we at? Where's the potential? And what promising practice can we derive from some of the non-defense AI applications that Roa discussed? And which of these could generate inspiration for how the process of wargaming, from game preparation to game execution and game analysis, be applied, and how could it improve that entire process? Which AI applications are showing the most promise? So out of all the ideas generated, which are actually worth investing in for the defense and security community, which could potentially be left to other parts of industry to lead, and where could defense divest its limited resources, which ideas are just a really terrible idea and which should be discarded. And we also wanted to understand what are the key challenges to the introduction of some of these promising AI applications to analytic wargaming. Next slide. To achieve these aims, we conducted a literature review. So we first looked at the technical and policy literature on defense and non-defense AI developments, as well as anything we could find on AI and wargaming trials. This was based on publicly available information, so there may be others that weren't publicly available, but I've done this briefing for quite a few government audiences, both in the UK and the US, and it seems like we broadly covered the main ones. And then we conducted some expert interviews with wargame designers, modeling and simulation experts, cognitive psychologists, non-defense AI decision support, technical experts, as well as AI legal and ethics experts. We then did a case study analysis where we compared some of the trials of AI in wargaming and tried to derive lessons learned and promising practice, as well as ideas on which AI applications could be taken forward for further development. And then we held an expert workshop where we invited everyone that we spoke to, and we asked them to both challenge and validate the AI use cases that we identified, but also to prioritize those applications into the categories invest, deploy, track, and discard. Invest as in, this is a worthy investment. It'll require a lot of R&D before we get to something that's usable, but it's worth it. Deploy as in, this is a pretty near-term capability, or it already exists and just needs to be applied to the AI and wargaming context. Track as in, this is a long-term R&D opportunity, but it's not worth the resources for defense specifically to be leading on this. And disregard as in, let's not explore this further. Next slide. Just a few caveats to add. This is a pretty nascent debate that's heavily influenced by a lot of AI hype. And there are a lot of good ideas on where AI and wargaming could go in the future, but most people that we spoke to either had never even thought about how AI could be integrated in these systems, but also, you know, we're very conscious of the media attention on AI at the moment, and I think given that a lot of our interviewees had variable understanding of how wargaming or AI works, this should be taken into account when you hear our findings. There were also highly polarized opinions among subject matter experts, particularly between the modeling and simulation experts and the professional wargaming designers who come from very different epistemological standpoints about the value of wargaming versus modeling and simulation. And there's also very little concrete evidence of effectiveness in a lot of the case studies that we found. Next slide, please. A few more notes on the scope. So by wargame, we really mean here analytic manual wargames with some simulated elements. So we're talking about kind of hybrid wargames. You can imagine something like a tabletop exercise that has a screen in the room, or apps, or laptops where some parts of the game execution are simulated, and some of them are still, you know, your more traditional tabletop exercise. And fully simulated virtual environments were beyond scope for this study. This is because there's already a lot of ongoing work on this happening in the UK that was commissioned by DSTL, so we didn't want to duplicate efforts. And also our definition of AI was very broad, include automation, was left to research participants to define. Next slide. So moving on to main findings, handing over back to Roa now.
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna has already mentioned, this is a very nascent field, but despite that, we did find several case studies that we mentioned in the report as being worth tracking for people who are interested in AI and wargaming. It's notable for this audience that all of these are US based. A lot of them are DARPA sponsored. So first of all, on this list, we have Gamebreaker AI. This is a DARPA sponsored project which used video games as a means to track wargaming, tasking teams to see if they could break a game by creating imbalance in it using AI, and therefore use that to track what might happen if you were to create a war game with very imbalanced teams. Again, this was a project collaborating with industry, so lots of different teams competing against each other in that. The next one on this list is DARPA's Brainstorm. This was based on STORM, which is the US Department of Defense model for multi-domain operations. And this is meant to assess whether AI can enhance course of action analysis, a theme which is repeated again and again in lots of the public efforts to use AI in wargaming. Course of action analysis is what people are really interested in. DARPA Shade is a bit different in that it looks more in the context of diplomacy rather than direct wargaming, seeing whether AI can emulate human diplomatic behaviors. Then we have DARPA Combat, which again is on course of action analysis, but this time specifically for red team cells, where humans were comparing AI-enabled courses of action to human ones and seeing which ones were deemed better by a human assessor. And then finally, DARPA Combat, which again was using AI to model red team behavior and using this to challenge blue teams in subsequent war games. And again, they say there's quite little evidence in the public domain about how successful some of these programs have been in developing results which show whether AI truly was effective in enhancing the war game. Some of them, in particular Gamebreaker AI, have published some very early results, but we think this is an area to track rather than an area to see these case studies and think the challenge has been solved. So one thing where I'm going to really emphasize that there's a need to go and look at our report itself is in reference to this long list of AI applications that we identified. In the report itself, we have an appendix which goes through each and every one of these AI applications in more depth and discusses exactly what our research participants thought about them. So as Anna mentioned earlier, we asked our participants to tell us whether they thought these things were ready to deploy now, whether they thought they should be tracked for the future, whether defense should invest, or perhaps even disregard them. And for each and every one of these, we go into it in more depth in the report, breaking it down into the 4 stages of AI and wargaming life cycles. If I go to the next slide, however, you can see which AI use cases were deemed most ready for adoption in the nearer term. And it's clear from this that these aren't evenly distributed through the AI lifecycle. As Anna is going to discuss shortly, game execution is a real challenge for introducing AI, and a lot of the use cases within this category will require future work and research. That doesn't mean they're not possible, but more needs to be done. But you can see in the game design phase, there are some already areas of hope. So AI red team agents might be able to be deployed in the nearer term. This does not mean fully automating red teams, but perhaps for some of the more tactical decisions, some of this can be automated. Procedural content generation is something which has made a lot of progress in the area of video games, and this should be tracked for near-term applications. And then finally, in this category is scenario and inject generation. We spoke to interviewees who already discussed using the likes of generative AI and ChatGPT to generate background content for their war games. But everybody discussing this emphasized the importance of double checking this using a human and only ever using this for a first pass at background content rather than core game mechanics. One area in game analysis which showed a lot of hope was data capture on player behavior. These are things like even human computer vision to track eye movements and therefore understand what decision-making rationale was for players, because often self-reported decision-making rationale is not accurate. And then finally, in the game logistics category, there was real-time language translation and speech transcription. These were very much raised as the lowest hanging fruits that could be deployed in the nearer term to enable distributed war games and data capture from war games. But I'm now going to hand back to Anna to discuss some of the longer term, more intractable use cases for AI.
Thanks, Roa. What's interesting to me, can we go back to the previous slide just quickly? Yeah, what's interesting to me is that every time that I talk about AI and wargaming, there's the most interest and enthusiasm on AI in some of the game execution applications. So things like, can you simulate your opponent's reactions? Could it take over adjudication, since this is what takes the longest? Well, some people say game preparation takes the longest, but just in terms of speeding up gameplay on the day, adjudication typically is a very like time-consuming activity. Could AI run through tactical decisions? Can we have virtual chatbots or course of action analysis tools and assistants to help our players explore other course of action that they may not be thinking of? Could AI help in providing legal or ethical reminders? But just looking at all the other applications, there seem to be a lot of near-term low-hanging fruit that could be readily applicable in the near term, but that receive far less attention than a lot of the game execution applications that we found. Next slide. So overall, as I mentioned, we asked our interview respondents and our workshop respondents to highlight exactly which AI applications are worth investing in the long term. So these are more advanced AI applications, which were both highly disputed, but also the ones that our respondents said would probably be the most transformative and could actually contribute towards decision advantage. But there's a long road ahead. So the three main ones that they mentioned were course of action analysis tools and decision aids, AI and adjudication, and a new one that we didn't see mentioned very much in the literature, but that the more I talk to people about AI and wargaming, the more and more they find interesting, is AI for analysis of player decision making. So there's a lot of interest in course of action analysis tools because it might speed up decision making. It might look at decisions that are made over and over again. It might reduce stress on the player's decision making in the gameplay environments. There's also a lot of interest in AI and adjudication, especially in how it might make adjudication less random than a roll of the dice. And then there was lots of interest in analysis of player decision making. How could we reduce bias or optimize the performance of the decision makers during the game so that they're exploring less kind of repetitive decisions, or they're kind of understanding, they have a better understanding of why certain decisions should be discarded. Could you make a blueprint of key decision makers' decision-making processes so that maybe even after they die, or if they're unavailable because of time constraints, you could still kind of emulate their decision-making in a war game. But there's still a lot of challenges before some of these more advanced AI applications could be realized. So for both course of action analysis tools as well as AI and adjudication, we're still not where we want to be in AI explainability to really understand how the AI comes up with particular outputs and suggestions on particular courses of action or outcomes in AI adjudication. We really need to be able to understand what course of actions were discarded or chosen. We also kept hearing that kind kind of automating these systems would make them quite inflexible to kind of new pathways. If, for example, you come to a better understanding of the threat picture as you play the game. So it wouldn't be able to work in the same way that a human being in charge of AI adjudication, a human being in charge of adjudication would be able to adapt to players' decision making. And also in wargaming challenges like hybrid threats and the gray zone, everyone's equally an expert, so it's difficult to have a complete results table. And essentially, it'd be difficult to have the data to conclusively know if the tool that you're making is making logical decisions on what potential course of actions are. And there are innumerable possible environmental factors at play as well. And on analysis of player decision-making, back to the previous slide, please. And on analysis of player decision-making, a lot of the ethical experts that we spoke to had concerns about, taking the decision-making patterns of some of these players, and whether you're kind of moving towards the territory of test subject research when you're using AI to essentially interrogate the decision making of senior battle staff. Next slide, please. So we essentially asked our respondents if this was still worth exploring despite all the challenges that they discussed. And even if there was a lot of skepticism, and even if some of the responses were quite varied and polarized, they could still come to the middle about these 3 points, and they still saw some promise in AI applications in tactical or abductive war games. So games where you kind of know the outcome that you want, but you perhaps want to see the different ways that you can reach that same outcome. And the more data you have, the more physicsy or mathematical it is, the more suitable AI was seen. Whereas in kind of like the more strategic decision-making areas, there were just too many unknowns based on the views of our respondents. And they also all united in that there needs to be significant investment in some of the cross-cutting enablers to unlock quite a lot of the different AI applications that we found. And that V&V procedures would be important to ensure the reliability and compatibility of these systems with rules of engagement, ethical standards, and explainability requirements. Next slide. So we also asked our interviewees and our workshop participants about what technical challenges and policy challenges they foresaw. And one of them was developing a valid wargame methodology in and of itself. So we didn't know this before we started the project, but there are quite a few people in the community who even question how reliable outputs of wargaming is fundamentally. One of our interview respondents said, "My own research is on the epistemology of gaming, and my position is that we don't know how any of this works or generates knowledge. I think it does." And he described how historically we'd just done wargaming for so long that we didn't really question if it was actually adding to our enhanced understanding of the strategic operating environment anymore. And obviously, depending on who you ask, you get people who say, well, yes, we necessarily have to simplify the game to make it playable. But the tension between how oversimplified is it to make it not useful for senior decision makers is very much in debate still across the community that we engaged with. The second major technical challenge is calibrating trust. So, it shouldn't be the objective necessarily to trust the outputs of AI, but how do you calibrate trust and mitigate against both under trust, as in just like biased over skepticism, but also over trust? So how do you make sure that your players aren't just absorbing what the AI generates and accepts it as truth because it's flashy and it's technology and it looks more complicated from the outside than it actually works? But also, how do you establish causality? Like, AI is better at correlation than causation at the moment. So although it could generate an output that looks like it could be realistic in the real world, you're still not able to know exactly if the different decisions that the players made actually would have caused that particular outcome. And then there are also issues around data access and system sovereignty. Like, you need to have so much data from different places of the defense and security environment. This makes it even more complicated if it was, say, a shared tool across allies, let's say a UK-US joint wargaming tool or a NATO level tool. How do you unlock all the different types of data that you need to make this usable? Like, there were a lot of interesting discussions around how it would be ideal to have a system that could integrate past wargaming data plus real world intelligence plus OSINT, and that could generate courses of action that could help decision makers essentially play the game with real world intelligence instead of synthetic intelligence or synthetic scenarios. But there's so many technical issues just to realize that kind of data integration, let alone to build a system that works. Next slide, please. And another thing that we asked our interviewees is if you had one takeaway message for DSDL, but I guess this applies to broader, the broader AI and wargaming community, or the broader wargaming community more generally, is, what is your key message if there's one thing that you wanted to highlight in the report? And the responses could be bucketed into 3 points. So first, AI won't resolve existing challenges to valid war game design or limitations in human decision making or the efficiency of war game development. If it's a badly designed war game, adding AI to it will only make it worse, because then you're adding layers of uncertainty and risk. If you have a bad decision maker, having AI included won't fix that either. And if you really wanted to improve the efficiency of preparing and developing war games, then you probably won't achieve that with AI. We even had people who said that integrating AI into wargaming might be the most expensive and the least effective way to improve decision making in defense. Of course, we also had people who were more optimistic, but just to give you a sense of the types of responses that we got. Also, AI still has insufficient contextual awareness, and the respondents that we spoke to had, I guess, a better technical understanding of how AI works, highlighted this over and over again. So to enable things like AI adjudication and course of action analysis, AI needs to understand what's happening on the board, and at the moment, it's not able to do that. So in the interim, something that you could do would be to digitalize the decisions that are being, and the moves that are being made in the real world environment. But that in itself takes time too. So you're just reintegrating more time to make up for the time that you saved from making some of these processes just that little bit faster. And again, over and over again, we kept hearing trustworthy and explainable AI is not yet sufficiently mature. There's an enormous amount of literature on this, but it's still not something that, we've simply resolved. But when you're integrating AI in such high stakes decision-making processes, like in defense and security, this is something that, we cannot risk. There's also like a really interesting interview that we had with someone who he was quite unique because he combined both extensive experience in wargaming, but also understanding of AI and modeling and simulation. And he described being commissioned to integrate some basic automation in his war games. And he said, sometimes I feel like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, because what people in the war game assumed the computer did was far more complex than it actually was. So this is something that we're trying to highlight with this report, is to, I guess, give senior decision makers who maybe bought into the glamour around AI and the hype around AI, to help them realize exactly like where it's at the moment, at what level of maturity. Next slide, please. There were also some policy and ethical challenges that were discussed. So, there are issues around accountability and liability if a decision maker makes the wrong call off the back of experiences of AI and wargaming. There were also concerns around reducing the decision-making pressure on players. On the one hand, the whole point of integrating AI and course of action analysis, according to some people, was to reduce that decision-making pressure. But on the other hand, some people were also concerned about an overall de-skilling over time of your decision makers. Like, do you really want them to be used to decision making with reduced pressure? Next slide. And then there's the piece about just psychologically preparing senior decision makers for human machine teaming. Most of them will have never encountered having to collaborate with AI on their decisions. And there will be a lot of skepticism. So how do you then prepare those people to be integrating AI in their day-to-day decision-making processes? And we heard from our interviewees that there would be value in starting small and just getting the players used to working with AI in relatively low risk applications before tackling some of these more advanced AI applications. So for example, that since everyone's talking about ChatGPT and everyone was talking about ChatGPT in scenario generation or in making some of the background noise, like the synthetic tweets, fake news reports and things like that, those are pretty low risk compared to things like course of action analysis and adjudication. But just seeing the value that it could bring to the wargaming process and those low risk processes could also enhance trust in the future. There was also, I won't go into this in a lot of detail because I don't want all my studies to be about issues around defense procurement and approvals, but anyone who's ever worked in defense knows that these are very slow, and this is a global issue, not just in the UK, but in the US as well. So you could have a system that has a pretty good methodology and that overcomes some of the technical challenges that we outlined. But if you don't receive it at the point of relevance because of all the different delays in the bureaucracy, then, what was the point? Next slide, please. So altogether, despite all these kind of polarized opinions around AI and wargaming, we really came away with 3 main conclusions. And the first is, to go back to basics and to lead with the question at hand rather than mysticism with the technology. So rather than ask the question, how do I integrate AI in all my war games? Ask, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What is it that I'm trying to better understand? Can I answer it with a simple war game or with a simple model and simulation? And if you can, then why not do just that? And if you were interested in exploring some of the more advanced AI applications, have a long-term strategy on how to do that in a responsible way, but also in how you're going to find the resources to invest in all the cross-cutting enablers, look into what the V&V procedures would need to be, enhance your understanding of wargaming epistemology and how to develop that valid wargame methodology, but also how to optimize decision making and gather evidence of how it's working compared to the traditional way of wargaming and modeling and simulation. You could do that by trialing some of the kind of more low risk narrow AI use cases in low stakes decision making contexts, and then increase the ambition over time. Did you want to add anything else to that, Roa?
I think that covers it very well. I think we're quite short of time perhaps for Q&A, so maybe we should hand back to Aubrey.
Well, thank you
Yeah,
so
fantastic.
much.
Excited to hear some questions.
Well, absolutely, and as you can imagine, they're rolling in. I'll take the last one first, and then we'll get to you, Mark, here in a second. The first question that we'll go ahead and pose to the group is from Colonel Gary Floyd. He goes by Pink. He's over at the United States Air Force MIT AI Accelerator, and I'm good friends with Andy Brown. So Pink, let's talk offline as well. He first of all says, "Hey, great presentation, and would love to collaborate, especially in the LLM space." Of course, I think that's kind of on the tip of everybody's tongue right now, especially with relation to GAN. So what his question is I'm wondering if you could expound upon considerations given to large language models. Did you engage anyone who had used LLMs in manual human driven war games? And again, he'd like to collaborate at some point. So I'll hand it over for that. Thank you so much.
So yes, definitely. We spoke to 2 or 3 professional war gamers who said that they were already using tools like ChatGPT to help with kind of generating a first pass of things like fake news articles or fake diplomatic cables. So they said that it still needed a lot of work, and you still needed someone who understood the strategic context to make sure that the output was sound. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting way of looking at it when they said that at the moment those sorts of tools are kind of like having a really, really dumb new intern. So it still needs a lot of work, but does it save you time? Yes, definitely. And there's definitely a skill to asking it the right questions to actually help your work as well that they're learning. But I'd be more wary of kind of using something like LLMs in collaboration with someone who was an expert on the topic. And there was still a lot of doubts from our other respondents who, talked about how, you can't even get it to make valid scenarios with materials that are referenceable. Like it can't reference its sources. So, and it uses a lot of rubbish data from the internet. So to what degree do you really want decision makers to be making assumptions based on scenarios that ChatGPT made? I'm not so sure, but over time, will it improve? There's definitely a lot of hope in that. There's a lot of ongoing work and a lot of investment happening to make that happen. But at the moment, it's still not very reliable. Did you want to add anything, Roa?
Not specifically on the AI applications for wargaming, but I think in the LLM space, it's particularly interesting to look at it on the flip side. So how can wargaming be used as a methodology to trial how risky LLMs might be in a defense context? And we haven't done that work, but we'll definitely be interested in it for the future. But I am aware of ongoing studies doing that. So that is definitely a space to track.
Perfect. And we'll as promised talk about Mark's question. His relates mainly to application of human laws in the technical way of thinking. So in other words, do you see a trend towards AI systems sort of inserting themselves in sort of what would otherwise be a legal decision making or a legal accountability concept? Over.
So whenever our respondents discussed this, they suggested that, you know, as the player is deciding on what the next possible moves are, if you had a course of action analysis tool, for example, and the system could have a reminder that said, these are some options, these are your risks, like it could also raise some of the ethical or the legal risks that you're taking. But beyond this, I don't remember that there was a whole lot of detail. Do you remember, Roa?
I remember when we were discussing, for example, adjacent sectors which we could learn from in terms of AI for wargaming, the legal sector did come up, but it was very much one where the emphasis was on human in the loop processes. So for example, if AI was ever to be near any decision-making capacity around legal compliance, sure, there might be some ability to search for relevant case law examples that could be used or relevant legal documents, but it would be one to be very careful about. So definitely we emphasize throughout the importance of human decision-making primarily. And even if we're talking about a wargaming context rather than real-world decisions, to remember that there can be a slippery slope between the two. But yeah, if that gets the question.
Like a note that came up over and over again as well, especially in the workshop, was, you know, like whose values, whose laws, whose rules do you encode in the system? Because even like coming to, even at a national level, you know, you have different political parties, you have different factions with different values across society, but this becomes even more exacerbated when you look at the global level. So the UN's doing a lot of really interesting work looking at AI related values. I think the work's already published, so go check that out if that's of interest. But they very convincingly illustrate how different international values are when it comes to AI. And so it'd be really difficult to have a, you know, like a set known a set way of programming your AI and wargaming system, for example, to, you know, only steer people towards like these decisions or these decisions. But there's definitely also a lot of ongoing research on this outside of defense and security. So we're tracking that in the Alan Turing Institute. And whenever we can, if this is of interest, then we can definitely pass on anything that we find that may be of interest to you as well.
Oh, perfect. That's amazing. I actually had a question myself. We're getting a couple maybe of other questions coming from the audience. You know, with regard to the decision-making space, did you find in your research that you know, so for example, we see this a lot in the computer vision space. So like AI will identify a person that police need to go and apprehend. They misidentify them. They get the wrong person, but they say, hey, look, the AI told me to arrest you, and so I've got to arrest you, even though common sense would suggest otherwise. Did you see, like, maybe, I don't know what you might call it, but like decision and accountability relief, like, oh, well, whew, you know, the AI said I could do it, so I'm going to go with it. But did you notice that in your study at all?
I think it was more the other way. I mean, Roa will tell me if she agrees, but I think it was more like there was a lot of, rather than decision relief, there was even more cynicism about how sure they could be about decision making when integrating AI. And there's an ongoing study elsewhere in the team on communicating AI enriched intelligence to senior decision makers that I think would be of interest to you, Aubrey, as well. So it's looking at not necessarily decision making frontline commands, but more like decision making at the cabinet office level. And what kind of assurances senior decision makers need to feel that, I guess, decision relief when you're integrating AI somewhere along the either intelligence analysis or the decision support process for high stakes contexts. But I don't know of a whole lot of research on this outside the defense and security program and the Turing at the moment. So I think there's a lot of interesting technical research happening, but not a whole lot of research around just asking the decision makers themselves, like how many studies have you heard where, you know, they're talking to battle staff about, you know, their preferences for the AI to behave, or what kind of value judgments should be integrated in an AI system. There's very little ongoing work at the moment. But when that report is out, which I think will be in early 2024, we can definitely make sure that that's sent over to you as well.
Well, perfect. Well, team, you guys, this is so wonderful. And I thank you so much for sharing your research and your insights with us. I know we're at the top of the hour. And so to respect everyone's time, we'll go ahead and close. But just incredible heartfelt thanks for the tremendous research that you guys have done. It is high impact. And I can already tell that our audience is very excited about it. I'm getting a lot of, you know, instant messages and things like that to share slides and other things like that. And so so I will definitely be following up with both of you here very shortly. So again, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And with that, we will sign off.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. Also, just to note, we're doing a whole lot more of US-UK collaboration on AI and wargaming, both for the technical and the policy research teams. We're doing a collaboration with the US DoD that will result in workshops in both the UK and the US on what the future of AI and wargaming should look like. So if this is of interest to you, then please do feel free to keep in touch. I'll put my email in the chat. And I can make sure that you're in the loop for any developments in the UK-US collaboration space there too.
Absolutely, and I'll be first to broadcast that out to all the attendees here to make sure that folks are tracking very closely, because this is an emerging area of the decision-making space in AI. So what you guys are doing is huge. I can't even explain it enough. So I'm very much looking forward to future collaboration with you, and then also the AI Accelerator over at MIT.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.
Thank you, Roa. Take care. So long.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.